So I have one thing in common with the critical drinker. We're both a fan of the heavyweights. However, while he is a critic who enjoys the whiskey, I drink the whiskey to cope with the critiques of others, in my case political ones. And in between swigs of alcohol, I weave in and out between wishing Papa Putin would just hit the damn red button already, and wicked to see a legion of Redditors vaporizing to fallout-lapping irradiated ghouls. And yes, while I am aware that is a disturbing joke, if, however, you are stupid enough to voluntarily enter a war zone, post your location online, and your shelled-out carcass ends up as broken wall decoration, that is not a tragic waste of life, that is Darwinism in action. So here's a take that made me reach for a bottle and thank Sargon's Getter account for this doozy, as I'm not allowed to venture into the cesspool of plebs that is Twitter. Look at this. This unhinged piece of work, Louise Mensch, bizarrely used to be a former Conservative MP. So with that said, and I've said this before, I refuse to believe that an opportunity to increase one's power or financial status is not the driving motive behind this kind of outlandishly wacky behavior. I refuse to believe people are this stupid and this susceptible to propaganda, because this is bad, really, really bad propaganda. In case you haven't noticed, we are winning this war. Press X to doubt. And we are going to remove Vladimir Putin, and we are going to bring Russia to heel. Bring Russia to heel. She sounds like Hillary Clinton there, doesn't she? It's funny, a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with Short Fat Otaku about this, and he said to me, but the difference is the West does not intend to invade Russia. Oh, and then Biden says this.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Between that, this one's tweets, and Graham calling for Putin's assassination, I'm gonna have to disagree there, Dev. There seems to be a fair few who very much intend to. It is a unipolar world, and Russia is going to accept that whether they like it or not, Via Victus. Via Victus means woe to the conquered. Remove Putin, bring Russia to heel. Russia is going to accept this whether they like it or not, Via Victus. Who the hell does this twisted bitch think she is, and why is she talking like an imperialist? Tell her, Amir.
War is the province of men.
Cheers, mate. Women, you're 50 years old and female. Know your place, shut the fuck up. What kind of a deluded psychopath says something like this? What the hell is wrong with you? It baffles me that anyone would say something like this on a public forum. I want to discuss something about how on earth we got here. If we look back at the end of the Second World War, one of America's most iconic statesmen, George Kennan, wrote the Long Telegram, a rather lengthy telegram sent to President Truman's State Department from Moscow on how to deal with the Soviet Union. So he correctly predicted post-war Europe will be a battle of East versus West. So he inspired much of America's Cold War policies, including the Marshall Plan and his famous containment strategy. After the fall of the Third Reich, the Americans come up with the Marshall Plan, which involved a large influx of money being pumped into war-wrecked parts of Europe as a means to prop up their economies and westernize the nations. The containment strategy was avoiding military confrontation with the Soviet Union through economic empowerment. The idea behind it being that sound economic structure and affluence would make it resistant against Soviet influence without engaging it militarily, which was a preferable alternative to potential nuclear entanglement. Nevertheless, military aggression was still a speculated threat, so NATO was born in 1949 as a means to deter Soviet aggression. NATO exists for over 40 years until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. Now, this moment I find fascinating, because if you look at those of political influence, people like George Kennan, Professor Mearsheimer, Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, Henry Kissinger, for heaven's sakes, they all agree that the expansion of NATO was a bad idea. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily correct, but when you see these massively disparate political voices who would likely never agree on damn near anything actually find common ground with each other, that to me is at the very least worthy of examination as to why. Because from my own personal experience, this seems to be the origin of divergence of opinion. We have the sane take and the insane take. I say insane because their take seems to include ideological goals and strategies that seem contradictory and downright counterproductive. And we have to remember the state of Russia with the dissipation of the Soviet Union. Russia is in free fall. Hyperinflation hits their economy. Russia is in utter ruin. People are buying the German Deutschmark, the American dollar, or the British pound. The Russian ruble is so worthless, bottles of vodka become the de facto currency in the early 90s, which is the most Russian thing ever. Apparently not the first time they've done this either, so stick to what you know, I guess. But this presents the perfect opportunity to introduce a Marshall-style plan for Russia, help them out, demilitarize them, and bring them into the Western world. But this isn't what happened. Despite Russia's destitute and dire circumstances, NATO said, "Fuck you," and continued to expand. George Kennan himself was horrified and outraged at this. Kennan said to NATO, "Look, I'm appalled at what you're doing. I think this is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. This, I think, is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. The expansion of NATO would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves." And George Kennan too, I think, if you saw the shit we're in now. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And they, the NATO expanders, will then say, "Well, we always told you that this is the way in which the Russians are going to behave. But this is just wrong." And this brings us neatly to the insane take, which makes perfect sense if you consider the perspective of the main actor involved in this scenario, NATO. NATO's been around for over 40 years at this point, and the American military-industrial complex is the driving machine that powers NATO. Its main reason for existing just fell. It has no reason to be around anymore. That threat is gone now. So they need to drum up a new reason to justify their existence pretty quick, because they're eyeing those former Soviet states and they're seeing dollar signs. And so they hatch up a new narrative, which is to say, the Russian people will always harbor imperialistic desires. It is the Russian gene. It is in their blood. They will never change. Now, by constructing this insanely dangerous narrative, the Americans are placing themselves on a higher moral position than the Russians, which pretty much allows them to act with complete impunity, without any consequence whatsoever. Because if the enemy is deemed morally repugnant and so worse than them, no act is too egregious. They have carte blanche to be deceitful assholes in their own self-righteous pursuits. Well done, we have the ends justify the means on steroids. And Kennan predicted everything that's come true as it is now to a T. Evidently, they did listen to George Kennan. They just did so for all the wrong reasons. They've been gobbling up all the former Soviet states, fucking around in Russia's backyard, making stacks of cash while doing so, as the American political regime sticks its fat fucking neoliberal fingers in every country it can, ignoring all of Russia's warnings, going right up to Russia's doorstep, and Russia is pissed off. Understandably so. But because most people aren't political junkies, they won't bother looking into the history of all of this. They will just swallow the mainstream drivel like the lemmings that they are, and now we're in this position. What a genius foreign policy. You know, I said to Adam, America's foreign policy apparatus. Imagine an entity with debilitating sociopathic cerebral palsy, but for some bizarre reason it also has these bouts of retard strength. That's America's foreign policy. It goes, "Ugh," and maws entire nations to pieces, and then fucks off. It's no bloody wonder so many people can't stand that arrogant American attitude. I'll be honest, I enjoy listening to the Russian side of things far more than the embarrassing amateurism that emanates from our sphere. And I credit that to being South African and living in Europe. I can see the culture perspective easier because I was raised in two different spheres. There are things about South Africa that I will never discuss with non-South Africans simply because people do not understand why. So it's easier for me to cross over. I was listening to Putin's speech a while back, how he approached it and his delivery. My word, it is so much more dignified and statesmanlike than any of the crap that we put out. It was eloquent, on point, and it made perfect sense from their perspective. And to all of the dimwits who say, "Oh, he's a ruthless autocrat," I don't care. That autocrat is putting you to shame. I don't know if it's because of the type of government that they have, their history, their current position, or how they see their place in it. But the way they speak about the world is so much more coherent. I want to give an example. These were taken from an interview with one Yevgeny Fyodorov, who is a high-ranking conservative nationalistic lawmaker in Putin's United Russia Party. So he was asked some questions about Russia and their position on the global stage. How does EU policy affect European states' energy consumption? The alternative to our natural gas is, of course, importing US liquid natural gas, which is much more expensive. The crucial interested parties in our piped gas are Europe and especially Germany. The key question arises from the fact that the EU wants absolute control over the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. They want to control everything. The principle of competition of nations is involved. Russia is also interested in full control over those gas supplies. It helps Russia to fulfill its obligations. We welcome no third party to play this game as an outside controller over the pipeline. Hence the Germans' position. They support Nord Stream 2 because it provides for their gas balance and they understand that otherwise they will lack gas. Nord Stream 2 is a kind of magic wand for Russia because it helps Germany to get a stable gas supply and sign long-term contracts. Otherwise, they will need to keep the temperatures in their dwellings very low. If the EU refuses to certify Nord Stream 2, Europe will freeze. It would be like shooting its own leg. The position of Europe is this: give us all transport routes and gas fields, but it contradicts the Russian principle of state sovereignty, so Russia won't agree to it. Our position is simple. We supply gas, and you can either take it or not. We are not going to sort out your domestic problems. What are the impediments to gas flowing through the recently completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Blocking Nord Stream 2 is a result of pressure from the Americans. There we need to understand common sense. What is in the American interest? It is a very basic interest. There is no economic profit in LNG supplied from the United States. The interest of the US is that they are generally against German economic independence and independent resources. Yes, we have American military troops in Germany. Germany is being controlled by the United States. In case Germany becomes too independent, it will simply throw away American control. This is just how history works. Of course, this is why the Americans are against Nord Stream 2, not just because of the competition with their LNG, but also because of the US anti-German policy. They dislike that Germany would gain a new level of economic independence, such level which would allow Germany to get rid of American control. It's clear that the US wouldn't like European countries, especially Germany, to become more powerful. So the US's geopolitical interest consists in Germany not being able to solve its problems with gas supplies beyond US's influence, without the influence from Ukraine, Poland, etc. As a result, Americans oppose Nord Stream 2 from the very beginning. It's obvious. But it's one thing when you control a few countries and manipulate them, and it's absolutely different thing when Germany will get a regular gas supply and will be independent of the US. It's the position of the US, and it's clear and understandable. The position of Germany: it needs a reliable gas supply and independence. The position of Russia: to earn money for its gas supply. With every coming year, Germany will become more and more sovereign or independent, and one day American troops will be withdrawn from its territory. I'm sure one day Germany will raise the question of withdrawal of American occupation troops from their land. You know, those troops were simply renamed from occupation troops into NATO's troops. It's in the interest of German people, and at some point Germans will do it. Russia will definitely help them, not in a military way, but by creating geopolitical foundation of free nations. How does the issue of sovereignty come into effect? What's the main motivation of any nation? Sovereignty and freedom. And if there are occupation troops on their land, it is anything but freedom. That's why any nation will demand occupation armies to leave their country, even if at the present they don't talk about it openly because of the propaganda. Germany is moving in this direction. It's a normal process. A unipolar world is neither normal nor legal in the historic context. Either there is one empire, like the Roman Empire of Alexander the Great, or the world is multipolar. There is no other option. Today's unipolar world is volatile, and Americans understand this. They have two options: either to create a colonial empire, but they aren't powerful enough to do it, or accept and embrace the multipolar world model. They are guided by the rules of competition among nations, according to which everyone is everyone's enemy. That's the way people live in the world. All the wars were caused by this. The logic is, you're the most powerful and the rest are suppressed by you. Everyone is suppressed by you. Not only major enemies like Russia, but allies as well. They are allies because American troops are on their territory, but not because they love America. Funny, I don't find myself disagreeing with anything he said. It seems perfectly reasonable. Something that I've noticed people have a very hard time doing. Just because someone says something that may seem hypocritical, especially that part about sovereignty when they invaded Ukraine, though bear in mind this interview was conducted back in January, that does not mean what they're saying isn't true. This is why it's important to listen to Russia's perspective. If we look at Gazprom, which is their natural gas company, largest company in Russia by revenue, and it's partly state-owned. I'm not a fan of that as such, I'm a free marketeer, and this kind of entity is not as free to respond to the whims and wishes of the free market. However, in this equation, there is another element that means there is more at stake here than simply the profit motive. And that's not only Russia's responsibility and reputation as a nation, but also its reliability as a seller of a much sought-after commodity, natural gas. So there's a third element that incentivizes Russia to engage with nations in a civilized manner. So when Russia spends billions on infrastructure to bypass third parties that would otherwise inflict unnecessary costs on their products, and invest in a way that would allow them to communicate and operate more directly with their buyers, you can say, well, they're just expanding their influence in the region. True, but it is also a wise free market move. It allows Russia to fulfill its obligations to other nations more effectively by removing the third-party involvement. It makes Russia look good. And then this invasion. Looking at the UN and all of the countries that voted to condemn Russia, there are 35 countries that abstained. Of the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the only one that condemned was Brazil. And I have a feeling there's a fair few of those nations who condemn on paper, but I don't think their hearts are very much in it. There's a fair few who are looking at how America is treating Russia thinking, perhaps we need to have a word about weaning ourselves off of America's influence. Because as it turns out, both Russia and China have been stockpiling gold for years now. They look to be playing the long game. There's also reports of the Saudis looking to sell their oil to China for the Chinese yuan. This has the potential for colossal impact on the global economy. After the Second World War, the dollar became the global reserve currency because it was backed by a fixed rate of gold. So trading dollars for gold increases the global demand for dollars. You can imagine the Federal Reserve loves that because it can print money which has to be repaid with interest. The problem was the foolish boob that was LBJ, who was deficit spending like a drugged-out juggernaut on the Great Society programs in the Vietnam War, and America's gold reserves were depleting rapidly as nation after nation was requesting gold for the dollars in the face of enormous mountains of debt accumulated by the outlandishly incompetent fiscal irresponsibility of the American government. But seeing as the end was nigh and this was not sustainable, in the 70s, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, went to the Saudis and said, "We will give you weapons and military aid and keep the Israelis from reducing you into a crater. You just have to sell your oil in dollars and put your surplus oil proceeds into US debt securities." And boom, the petrodollar was born. And this has been the trading currency for oil sales worldwide for about half a century, and what has kept the global demand for US dollars in play. America can buy oil with a currency it can print out of thin air. And quite a bit of America's foreign policy starts making a hell of a lot more sense now, doesn't it? Why do you think Gaddafi in Libya was knocked off? He wanted to sell his oil for an African currency called dinars, which was backed by gold, so NATO helped take him out. Here's another one. Guess who wanted to sell their oil in euro because the euro is more valuable than the dollar? Saddam Hussein. Guess which countries Iraq had oil contracts with prior to the invasion of Iraq? France, Russia, and China. And now that Biden has a soured relationship with the Saudis because he opened his senile old mouth, they won't take his calls. Now China is trying to slip into the equation and buy Saudi oil outside the petrodollar. Isn't payback a bitch? So, what do you suppose would happen then? If the global demand for the dollar collapses, the currency loses a substantial portion of its value and is sent back in mass to its country of origin that has over $30 trillion in debt. Oh, hello, Weimar Republic. And then we get to Biden, dear Lord help us. This moron comes out and says, "My God, this man cannot remain in power," referring to Putin, which screams regime change from the damn rooftops. Then a random White House spokesperson, unknown by the way, does damage control trying to downplay it. You have to ask, who the hell are you and how do you know what the president, in quotes, was thinking. How are you able to contradict the so-called commander-in-chief? Under what or whose authority? Which is even funnier because a reporter asked him about this comment and asked if he'd walk it back, and Biden said no. I cannot overstate the severity of the insanity that we currently find ourselves in. We know this man is doped to the gills, and my word, his aides must sweat buckets every time he walks in front of a camera. It's a fucking tightrope. Notice, just one moment of him talking off the cuff results in the White House needing to do damage control every single time, and this is so not the time geopolitically for this kind of crap. He is not allowed any autonomous thought at all, which pretty much makes him a programmed antique. Someone tell me I'm wrong. You know, there's already a large chunk of the population who thinks the vote is rigged and the presidents are selected. Not an all that unreasonable position when you look at the predictably disastrous foreign policy of the last roughly 3 decades, regardless of which party is in power. And Biden coming out and saying,
America is back.
What does that mean? It's shit like this that gives those who believe democracy is a farce credence, because it very much looks like it is. This is why no one trusts the American regime, because it looks like those who are actually in charge are not seen publicly. It's run by shadows. You know, I'll say this. There is a part of me that thinks America is more corrupt than Russia. There is. And you can say, dude, what the crap are you smoking? Fair enough. You can make the case that Russia's corruption is more dense and concentrated, sure. But it's also much more localized compared to America. America is much more powerful. Their global influence is much more far-reaching than Russia's. America's corruption and incompetence is much more damaging. It topples entire nations, for heaven's sakes. Which brings us amusingly to the second part of this demented imperialistic wench's tweet. As far as I am concerned, we need to be concerned with your mental stability, you freaking lunatic. We are taking revenge for Afghanistan and for 2016. Okay? For the interference in Brexit, for Extinction Rebellion, the Yellow Vests and Indie Ref, for Canada 2015, and the trucker convoys and Koof misinfo. Clearly, we are off into fantasy land, where elves will give us DMT and the world's aflutter with pixies dressed in drag. Because the amount of power, and frankly, benevolent influence that Putin wields is just... What? Looking at that list, almost all of that is an opposition, a pushback against governing incompetence or dictatorial-like state overreach. And the person they think is fomenting and galvanizing that pushback is a KGB agent of the former Soviet Union. What the fuck? How did you get to that? Why would Putin do this? How does he benefit from any of this? Oh, look, it's Putin coming to rescue the West from its own destructive decadence. Woo! Fucking hell, it's no wonder Westerners like Putin, our own branch of authoritarian nitwits, are propping him up as a classical liberal. How the hell did we get here? My word, yesterday I'm listening to Mark Levin and Newt Gingrich, pair of idiots, talk about what Putin fears and Xi fears is representative government and democracy. I am fucking sick of hearing about liberal democracy. What an absolute crock of shit. Can you two gits stop peddling this delusion you're both smoking and admit this is all a racket? Look at what's making the rounds lately. We are talking about Will Smith smacking Chris Rock, which is hilarious. The first time I've seen the media give a damn about black-on-black violence ever. A male competing against females in sports, and yes, that is a male. I will not call that thing a female. I don't care what hormones or drugs you snort, swallow, inject, or insert rectally. This radical black bint being elevated into a lifetime position on the frickin' Supreme Court, who has a disturbing leniency on child sex offenders, who was chosen for no reason other than her race and sex, who is merely the result of a shady backroom deal to secure the black vote in South Carolina, and she can't even fucking identify what a female is despite being chosen for being one. We have a colossal amount of tech censorship openly hiding the depraved corruption of the drug-addicted crackhead son of the current marionette LARPing as president, corruption they labeled as Russian disinformation months ago that they now fully acknowledge is in fact true, and yet fuck all is done about it. They just went, whoops. Every so-called intelligence agency, what a fucking joke that is, got it wrong, and not a single one has said jack shit since. There is no incentive for them to clean up any existing corruption. Just spin a tale of your opposition is somehow more corrupt than you, and then happy fucking days. So don't talk to me about representative government when most of your own fucking party thinks the current government is illegitimate through what appears to many as the shadiest election they have ever witnessed in their lifetime. And you have the fucking gall to tell us this monstrosity you have erected is what you peddle to the world as a net good? You don't have freedom. What you live in is a complex Orwellian system. Go read A Gentle Introduction to Unqualified Reservations by Mulbach and tell me it isn't damn accurate. You can take your precious liberal democracy and shove it up your ass. Fuck it, I'm out.